Good afternoon, TechNation. Welcome to Webinar Wednesday. We are excited to have over 435 registered attendees for today's webinar, which is eligible for 0.1 CE credits from the ACI. Let's get started by giving away one lucky attendee an I Am TechNation t-shirt. Today's presenter, Steve Maull, prepared a video homage to his industry mentor, who was honored with the Medical Dealer Lifetime Achievement Award in 2001. Name this mentor. Answer now using the questions feature on your dashboard. While we're waiting for those responses to come in, I want to remind everyone to join us for this year's Imaging Conference and Expo, which will bring together 400+ imaging service professionals from across the nation to Chicago for 2 days of learning, networking, and the latest advances in imaging. ICE has been approved for 26 continuing education credit hours by the ASRT. Registration is now open. Receive complimentary admission by using the VIP pass included in today's workbook. Details can be found at attendice.com. All right, and the winner of our I Am TechNation t-shirt is Michael Berner. Congratulations, Michael. The correct answer is Manny Roman. TechNation would like to thank our sponsor, Maull Biomedical Training. Maull Biomedical Training provides training on contrast injectors manufactured by Bayer Medrad and Leibel Fleischmann, Covidian, and others with over 25 years biomedical service and training experience in the military and civilian sector. Maull can provide high-quality injector training that will allow you to perform your own operational inspections, preventative maintenance, calibrations, calibration verifications, and repairs. Visit maullbiomedical.com for more information. Our presenter today is Steve Maull, the founder and president of Maull Biomedical Training. After joining the Air Force in 1991, he served as a BMET for 7 years before becoming a BMET instructor and curriculum developer for the Air Force and newly developed Department of Defense BMET. In 2001, he became an instructor at DITEC, where he taught until 2008 when he started Maull Biomedical Training with the express purpose of providing high-quality contrast injector service training. Steve, you may begin whenever you are ready.
Thank you, Kristen. Welcome, everybody, to Introduction to Contrast Injectors. What we're going to go over right now over the next 45 minutes to an hour is all the basics on contrast injectors. Now, first off, the good news, all contrast injectors are basically the same. You've seen one, you've seen them all. They're not complex systems at all. I know they're in the imaging department. Sometimes they're actually hooked up to the imaging systems, which makes them seem a little more daunting than they really are. But at the end of the day, it's just a pump. The operator selects a flow rate, a volume, a pressure limit, presses a button, and fluid squirts out the end of the syringe. Okay? So, getting started, first off, we want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So what we're going to cover now, or over the next, like I said, 45 minutes or so, we're going to go over the basics of angiography, the purpose and types of contrast injectors. We'll go over the injector components and the operation of the injectors. Then finally, we'll go over items related to PM and calibration verification procedures, and then finally talk a little bit about some test equipment that's needed. Now, just so we're all on a level plane here, I don't know how many of you have absolutely no imaging knowledge at all. Starting off, here's our basic X-ray system. We have an X-ray tube, we have our X-ray table, and underneath or inside the table, we have some image capturing device. Now, as the patient's on the table and X-rays go into the patient, some of the X-rays that go into the patient will be absorbed by the patient. Some of those X-rays will penetrate the patient and strike that image capturing plate on the other side. Now, this image capturing device used to be film back in the good old days, but now they're all digital plates, either CR or DR of some sort. And think of those plates starting off as a white blank image. And as X-rays strike that plate, the plate gets darker. And the more X-rays that strike the plate, the darker the plate becomes. Okay? Now that's an important aspect of the purpose of contrast injectors. Now, the radiation that penetrates the patient, you have to remember that the X-rays make the plate turn darker. And again, the plate starts off as a white blank image. Now, to get a good image, we need just the right amount of penetration through the patient. If we have too little or too much penetration, that's a bad thing. Let me slow my video down here a little bit. If we have too much penetration, the image will be too dark. Because remember, X-rays make the plate turn darker. So as X-rays penetrate the patient, if too much radiation penetrates the patient, we have too much radiation or too much penetration, the image is too dark. Vice versa, if we don't have enough penetration through the patient, too much absorption by the patient, then the image is too light. In either case, we do not have a good image. So the odds that that X-ray photon is actually going to pass through the patient and strike the plate is determined by the thickness and the density of the body part that those X-ray photons are coming into contact with. Now, thicker and denser body parts, such as bone, are more likely to absorb an X-ray photon. So the parts of the imaging plate that are shielded by thicker, denser body parts, such as bone, don't get struck by as much radiation. So those parts of the image, like here on the bone, those images stay lighter as areas on the plate. Now, less thick, less dense body parts, such as soft tissue, skin, blood vessels, for instance, they are not very thick and they're not very dense. So an X-ray photon is more likely to pass right through softer tissue, strike the imaging plate, and make those parts of the plate and those parts of the image darker. So you see here on this particular radiographic image here, the thicker, denser body parts, such as the bone, show up as lighter areas on the X-ray image, whereas the soft tissue shows up as just blacked out areas. You'll notice there are no blood vessels shown here. Now, in a normal X-ray image, such as this radiograph, we don't care that we don't see blood vessels. Most of the time when we're taking an X-ray, we're just interested in seeing the bony materials anyway. Now, blood vessels are neither thick nor dense. That's why they don't show up on an X-ray image. Now, sometimes we do want to see the blood vessels. For that to happen, for a blood vessel to actually show up on the X-ray image, we have to put something in the blood vessel during the procedure so that the blood vessels do absorb the X-rays and show up as lighter areas on the X-ray image. That is what the contrast injector is for. You'll see here, this is a fluoroscopic image without getting in. For those of you who are not imaging personnel, fluoro is basically an X-ray image viewed in real time on a monitor. Now, this is a very good example of how effective contrast fluid is. You'll see here on your fluorograph, right now, we don't really see the blood vessels too well. They don't show up on the image very well because they're being penetrated by X-rays. They don't show up. As we inject contrast fluid into the blood vessels during the procedure, you can see that the blood vessels darken up and show up as X-rays on the image. Now, this is angiography, what we're describing here. Angio means blood, ography means the viewing of. So angiography is the viewing of blood vessels, and it's typically only possible when we are using these contrast injectors. Now, there are three types of imaging equipment that utilize contrast injectors. They are X-ray, CT, and MRI. So since there's three kinds of imaging systems that utilize X-rays or utilize contrast injectors, there's three types of contrast injectors: angio or X-ray injectors, CT injectors, and MRI injectors. Now, I mentioned earlier that basically you've seen one, you've seen them all, and that is true for the most part. 90–95% of all contrast injectors are identical to each other. But there are subtle differences that do make an angio injector different from a CT injector and slightly different from an MRI injector. And we're going to talk about those, some of those subtle differences right now. So first off, let's talk about the angio, or the X-ray injectors. Now, this particular injector, this is going to be located in your specials, your cath lab. This is going to be in the room with the big giant C-arm in it, basically. Now, angio injectors, just due to the nature of the beast, just how they are used, they are capable of what are considered relatively high flow rates. An angiographic injector can go up to 40 to 50 milliliters per second flow rate. Again, it's just how they're used and what they're used for. Sometimes we need a massive quantity of contrast in a particular region of interest immediately. Because of these high flow rates, contrast back up a little bit here. Angio injectors are also capable of very high pressures. Now that is pressure limit, and you'll notice that is in PSI. That is 1,000 pounds per square inch. In some instances, these injectors can be programmed to go as high as 1,200 PSI. So very high pressures due to the very high flow rates and the very small orifices these contrast fluids are going to be injected through. Now angiographic injectors are single syringe injectors only. Mark 5 Plus, Provis, Assist, Angiomat Illumina here. These are angiographic injectors. They only have one syringe on them. All angiographic injectors or X-ray injectors are single syringe injectors, and they're obviously going to be injecting contrast fluid. Now, the other kind of contrast injector is a CT injector. And obviously, this injector will be located in the CT room. Now, unlike its angiographic counterpart, the highest flow rate that a CT injector can be programmed to is 10 milliliters per second. And again, that's also due to the nature of how a CT procedure is done. CT procedures are relatively slower procedures, so there's never a time when we need a massive quantity of contrast injected very rapidly. So at its highest end, a CT injector can only inject contrast fluids or saline fluids at a rate of 10 milliliters per second, which compared to the angiographic injector we just talked to is very, very low. Now, because these injectors, CT injectors, are only capable of flow rates of 10 milliliters per second, they are considered relatively low pressure injectors. In this case, the CT injector can only go up to a pressure of 325 psi. Now, CT injectors, they come in both dual and single syringe configurations. Some CT injectors just have the one syringe, and it's full of contrast, obviously. Some CT injectors are dual syringe injectors, meaning one syringe that has contrast in it, the other syringe has saline in it. Now, finally, the third kind of contrast injector is an MRI injector. MRI injectors are obviously located in the MRI room, and they are very similar to their CT counterpart. They only go up to flow rates of 10 milliliters per second. They only have pressures that go up to as high as 300 psi, and unlike their CT injectors, all MRI injectors are dual syringe injectors. They all have a saline syringe and a contrast syringe. Now, the biggest difference between an MRI injector and a CT injector, they both do pretty much exactly the same thing the same way, but what makes them different is this entire pedestal here with the CT or with the injector head on it is in the MRI suite with the MRI system. It is in the magnetic field. Now, due to that, this entire system has to be made of all non-ferrous or non-magnetic material. Otherwise, things like this happen. If you guys are familiar with MRI, you're familiar with how incredibly powerfully strong these magnetic fields that they produce are. I mean, this is a hospital bed. I have so many questions about this picture right here. Whose great idea was it to push the bed into the room? Was the patient in the bed when this happened? What was the look on the person's face the second they realized what was happening? How did they get it out? This is how powerful the magnetic field in the MRI suite is. So the big difference between an MRI injector and a CT injector is how, or the material that the system is made of. An MRI injector is made completely non-ferrous material. So things like that don't happen. Now, moving on to the fluid that's actually injected into the patient during these procedures. For angio and CT injectors, they use an iodine-based contrast fluid. And the reason for that is angio and CT injectors, while they are vastly different imaging systems, they are both utilizing the same technology, which is X-rays to produce the image. Now, the reason they use iodine for angio and CT injection angiographic procedures is because, simply put, iodine blocks X-rays. Don't know why, don't care. It has something to do with the atomic structure and how the electrons orbit the nucleus of the iodine atom. But simply put, iodine blocks X-rays, just hit the I believe button and move on. Now, the other kind of injector, MRI injectors, MRI does not use X-rays to produce the image. They use a magnetic field and RF pulses to produce the image. Iodine has absolutely no effect on RF pulses or magnetic fields. So to get the same effect on the image, which is the blood vessels being highlighted on the image, they use gadolinium as the contrast fluid. Gadolinium does actually alter how the water molecules in the body react when in a magnetic field and bombarded with RF pulses. Long explanation, we don't have time for this, but again, just the effect is exactly the same. For iodine-based contrast fluid, gadolinium just makes the blood vessel show up greater on MRI images. The contrast that's injected into the patient's bloodstream over the next 12 to 24 hours is just eliminated through the body's natural waste process via the kidneys and the liver. Now, as I mentioned a couple of times already, all contrast injectors, like I mentioned, are basically the same. They all have the same three components. Back this up just a split second here. Every contrast injector has a head, a display, and a main unit. All contrast injectors. There's roughly a dozen different models out in the world. All dozen fall into one of three different types, so it doesn't matter make, model, manufacturer, type. Every contrast injector has the same three components: the head, the display, and the main unit. So first off, let's go over the injector head. The injector head has certain buttons on it that allow it to be used. All right, and those are the enable button, the forward and reverse load buttons that drive the plungers up and down, and the manual knobs down here at the bottom. Let me pop that back a little bit. There's your manual knobs down there. Now, the purpose of these three controls on the injector head, the enable button, forward and reverse load buttons, and the manual knobs, they are used to fill and prime the syringes with the fluid and then connect it to the patient. Now, first off, the enable button and the forward reverse load buttons. As you can see here, first thing the operator has to do, they have to hit the enable button. The purpose of the enable button is to activate the forward and reverse load buttons. My forward and reverse load buttons here, they don't function until the enable button is hit. And the purpose of that is a safety feature, because we don't want the contrast injector attached to the patient, and then the operator or somebody grab the injector head to move it or rotate it or something like that and accidentally push the forward and reverse load buttons, and then we're either pushing or pulling fluid into or out of the patient. So to prevent something like that from happening, the forward and reverse load buttons are deactivated until the enable button is pressed. So once the enable button is pressed, then our forward and reverse load buttons become active. Now, most of the time, most contrast injectors have variable speed load buttons. There's slow, medium, and fast forward, and then there's also slow, medium, and reverse as well. Now, the manual knobs, the primary function, really the only function of the manual knob is just to manually prime the syringe and the connector tubing of any air. Once the syringe has been filled up, they'll typically use the manual knob just to get out any air bubbles or any air that's left in the syringe or connector tubing before actually hooking it up to the patient. That's really the only purpose of the manual knobs. Now, when we're filling the syringe, once we've attached the syringe to the actual injector head, first thing we're going to do is we make sure the syringe is driven all the way to the top of the plunger is all the way at the end of the syringe. We'll drive the plunger all the way to this tip. Then we attach something called the J-tube. Now, that's the J-tube that we've attached there. The J-tube comes in the container or in the package with the actual syringe. So one of the first things you're going to do is, once you've walked into the room and you need to start your maintenance, one of the first things you have to do, if you haven't already done it, is ask them for a syringe. The syringe, the department literally has cases of them. They should give you a syringe. In the container with the syringe should be a J-tube, and sometimes it actually has connector tubing with it as well. So that's where you get the J-tube. Comes with every new syringe. Once the syringe is attached, we're going to typically put the end of the J-tube into your container of water. They'll obviously need contrast, but for maintenance purposes, you just use water. We're going to use the forward reverse load buttons to fill the syringe up with as much contrast or fluid as we need in there while getting out all the air that we can. Then we drive the plunger backwards to fill it up with as much fluid as we need. I think here we're going to 100 milliliters. Then with the tube, then with the J-tube, this is important, the operators know this, with the end of the J-tube still in the container of water, you remove the J-tube, because that basically all the fluid that's in the J-tube gets pulled back into the container. Then once that's done, once we have our syringe filled with water, we are going to connect our connector tubing. Then using the manual knob, we will purge out any air that's in the connector tubing before we connect it to the patient, or in our maintenance purposes, put it in our container to drain the fluid out. And we're all set. That is how you connect, fill, prime, and fill, prime, and connect the syringe and connector tubing to the patient. When I teach all the time, I keep having the urge to ask if there's any questions. So if there's any pertinent questions popping up, let me know.
Steve, we do have one question that came in from the audience. If you'd like to take a moment to address it.
Yeah.
What is the minimum frequency period time required to PM an injector, and do they all get preventative maintenance at the same way?
Well, if I understand the question, the annual PM or the PM for contrast injectors is annually. If you're asking how long does a PM take, it takes roughly 1 hour. Sometimes it can take 2 hours. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. It really kind of depends on how much cleaning is needed. The operators are supposed to clean the injector on a daily basis. Yeah, I'm not thinking that happens every time. So basically, you're looking at 1 or 2 hours for a PM. Typically 1 hour. 2 hours is kind of long, but it could stretch that far. And then the manufacturers do recommend it be an annual event. There's really no need to do it more than once a year unless excessive cleaning is needed. And what was the last part of the question? Oh, the PM. Yeah, the PM procedure for every contrast injector is nearly identical. You're basically going over an operational check. You are going to verify pressure limits. You're going to check flow rates and volumes. There's a cleaning that needs to be done on every contrast injector because the operators spill contrast all over the thing when they're using it. And yeah, and it's basically the same tools and test equipment needed for every contrast injector as well. So like I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the presentation, not only if you've seen one, you've seen them all. If you worked on one, you know how to work on all of them. It's basically the same procedure using the same tools and test equipment on all the injectors. Again, each one's going to have a little quirk or bell or whistle or feature that's kind of unique to it, but for the most part, yeah, they're all the same operation, same maintenance. All right. Now, when we're filling the syringe, this is something that the operators know, and this is something that the maintenance personnel need to know as well, because this does come into play with what when we're doing PMs and pressure checks and things like that. And this also lends itself to one of the common issues, one of the common problems with a lot of the contrast injectors that pop up relatively frequently. Whenever we are filling the syringe, or the operator is filling the syringe, the injector head is always tilted up. Now the reason for this is, when we fill the syringe, air will get in the syringe. So the last thing we're going to do before we go firing it is purge the air out. So the injector head needs to be tilted up to get any air out when we prime it. Now once it's primed, yeah, and we're going to inject the fluid into the patient, the injector head is always tilted downward. It has to be at least 30 degrees below zero. The obvious purpose of this is if there is any air left in the syringe, then those air bubbles should float to the non-business end of the syringe and not get injected into the patient. Now some injectors, some models, the Mark 7, the Angiomet Illumina, the OptiVantage, they can actually sense the head tilt position. Not all injectors do that, but some models do. The system can actually tell if the injector head is not tilted below 30 degrees horizontal. Depending on the model, some of them will just warn the operator, hey, you haven't tilted the head down far enough, and give the operator the option of either bypassing it, saying, I know I want to shoot it anyway, or some models will completely inhibit the injection until the injector head is tilted far enough down. Now, the syringes, like all syringes in the United States, they are disposable, single-use only. Now, that is if we're using them on patients. Now, for us maintenance personnel, we use that syringe over and over and over and over again. Your syringe, if you're a maintenance person and you get a syringe because you're getting ready to do maintenance on this Provis or Stone or whatever, ask the department for the syringe. Don't throw it away. That syringe should last you for years. I mean, unless you physically break it, the syringe is good for a very, very long time. But because during procedures, blood and biologicals can't get on the syringe or in the syringe, they only use them one time for patient use. But again, for us, you want to keep them. They'll last you a very long time. And with very few exceptions, the syringes are model specific. When you have a syringe, you don't have a syringe for all the injectors. If you have a Stone syringe, that means you have a syringe that just fits the Stone. It doesn't fit anything else. There's a couple exceptions to that rule. The CT9000, the CT9000, the Optivantage use the same syringe. The Mark V Plus and Provis use the same syringe, but those are the rare exceptions to the rule. For most of the time, each syringe is model specific. Now, some syringes, and this is based on the type of contrast injector that we're using, some syringes actually have heaters connected to them. Now, angio injectors and CT injectors, because both of these systems use X-rays to produce the images, they are both using an iodine-based contrast fluid to produce the angiographic images. So because both angio and CT injectors use iodine, if you guys have ever worked with it or been messed around with it, there is it's very thin. It's nearly as thin as water, but there is a slight syrupy texture to it. So to help keep our pressures from being built up too much in the syringe during an injection, we will warm the contrast up. Everybody knows when you warm contrast up, or when you warm syrup up, you make it warmer, you lower its viscosity, it becomes more runny. What we want to do is we want to lower the viscosity of the contrast fluid as much as possible, because we're going to be injecting this contrast fluid through very thin needles and catheter tubes. So even the slightest amount of viscosity being lowered, making it just the slightest bit more flow more easily, a little more runny, can dramatically help us decrease the pressure in the syringe during the actual injections. Now, your normal body temperature is around 37 degrees Celsius, so they try to keep the contrast in a warmer, in a warming cabinet. The bottle of contrast they fill the syringes up with, they'll keep it in a warmer at 37 degrees Celsius. Then they'll take the contrast bottle out, they'll fill the syringe up, and then they will put a warmer on the syringe. Now, what the warmers do, they will not warm contrast up from room temperature, which is around 70 degrees Celsius, to body temperature, which is around 98 degrees 7 degrees Fahrenheit up to 98 degrees Fahrenheit. But what it will do is it will help keep the contrast warm longer. So if you put 37 degrees Celsius contrast fluid into a syringe and then put a warmer on it, it will maintain that temperature much longer than if it didn't have a warmer on it. Now, when it comes to MRI injectors, back up a tiny bit, this is a Spectra Solaris injector head, and these are the two syringes on it. Actually, it's a Spectra's head. Notice there are no heaters on the MRI syringes. MRI injectors do not use heaters because, again, MRI uses gadolinium as its contrast fluid, not iodine. Gadolinium doesn't need thinned out, so MRI injectors never have heaters on them. Just your CT and angio injectors right here. That's a Provis head, putting a syringe heater around the pressure jacket. All right. Now we're actually going to get into the programming and injecting of the contrast fluid. Now, when it comes to programming and injection, there's many parameters that the operator can select for a particular protocol when we want to perform an injection and inject fluid into the patient. There's many parameters that can be selected, but only 3 of them have to be selected. Everything else can be blank. Everything else can have a 0 on it, but there are 3 parameters in a protocol that must have some value to them, and that is the flow rate, the volume, and the pressure limit. Now, the flow rate, and this is, I'm just going to, so everybody's on the same page. I'm sure everybody's biomed, so I'm sure everybody's at least familiar with these terms, but we'll go over them just anyway. The flow rate is the speed of the injection. How fast are we going to fire fluid into this patient? And it is nearly always in milliliters per second. There are some injectors that will do milliliters per minute. One even does milliliters per hour. I have no idea why that would be. I mean, I've never even seen them use milliliters per minute, but some of them have that option. But it's pretty much always in milliliters per second. So the flow rate is the speed of the injection, how fast we're going to fire fluid into the patient, regardless of how much. Now, the volume is the total quantity of fluid that we're going to inject in the patient, regardless of the speed. And the volume is always programmed in milliliters. Now, the pressure limit, this is a subject that during, we talk about it quite a bit during the class. Pressure limit is a simple concept, but it's a concept that is sometimes misunderstood by the actual operators. Most operators, the vast majority of operators out there, they understand pressure limit, they do it correctly, but every once in a while you run into an operator who thinks they understand what pressure limiting is, and they don't. And that does have a negative impact on the patient, because if you don't do the pressure limit correctly, it can, I mean, it doesn't hurt the patient, but it can disrupt the actual procedure needlessly. Now, the pressure limit is the maximum pressure allowed, and this is the sometimes misunderstood part. This is the maximum pressure allowed in the syringe during an actual injection. Now, when we're performing an injection, you have your syringe, and then you have that thin connector tubing you guys saw me connect it to earlier in one of the videos. That high pressure, let's say we programmed a pressure limit of 1,000 psi. Now, what that means is during this coming injection, we do not want the pressure in the syringe to exceed 1,000 psi. And again, the important part there is in the syringe. You have to go back to your fluid dynamics and understand that when the syringe, or when the fluid leaves the syringe, when it goes from the large bore of the syringe to the very thin tubing that's coming out of the syringe, that is where we are going to get our dramatic exponential drop in pressure. In the syringe, we would have, say, 1,000 psi. When that fluid gets out of the syringe and into the connector tubing, we are literally down to single-digit pressures, down to less than 10 psi. Okay, and here in the United States, the pressure is always measured in psi, pounds per square inch. A lot of injectors do give you the option to do it in kilopascals or kilograms or even millimeters of mercury, but it's pretty much always measured in pounds per square inch. Now, the primary determinant of how much pressure gets built up in a syringe during the actual injection is the flow rate. There's several other things that do affect how much pressure gets built up in a syringe during the injection, but the primary determinant of pressure in the syringe is the speed of the injection, the flow rate. Now, if you look here, we program a flow rate of 3 milliliters per second. And during our test, we inject the fluid through a fixed size orifice, a needle valve or some other orifice. And we're performing this injection, a 3 milliliter per second flow rate through that needle. That is going to give us, in this case, a pressure of 292 psi. Now, if we up the flow rate to 5 milliliters per second, and we perform a higher flow rate through that same needle valve, you see we get a pressure of 596 psi through that same needle valve. So the purpose of that video was just to demonstrate the primary thing that causes pressure built up in the syringe, or determines how much pressure is built up in the syringe during the injection, is the speed of the injection, the flow rate. Now, if something were to occur, the whole purpose of the pressure limit is to set the maximum pressure that we will allow in the syringe during the actual injection. Do not, if we set the pressure limit to 600 psi, we're telling the injector, no matter what, don't exceed 600 psi in the syringe during the injection. Now, if something were to occur, and for some reason we did actually hit that pressure limit in the syringe, let's say we did hit 600 psi during the injector does not shut off. This is an important point that is also a cause of confusion sometimes with the operators. It is important to know that when we hit, if we hit the pressure limit, the injector doesn't shut off. We don't want to stop the injection. What the system does is to prevent the pressure to keep rising and rising even higher and higher and higher, it will slow the flow rate down. It will just bring the flow rate down to some level. It either keeps us right at the pressure limit, or it drops our pressure limit down to a much lower value. But that's how the injectors handle a pressure limit situation. It doesn't stop the injection, it just slows the flow rate down. And that is the reason that sometimes if the operator is not programming the injection properly, if they don't have a complete understanding of pressure limiting, if they are supposed to set this system up and we're going to shoot this injection at a flow rate of 5 milliliters per second, and we should set this pressure limit to 600 psi, and the operator's thinking, man, 600 psi, that is 600 pounds, and the tip of this catheter is going in the patient's right atrium, inside their heart. Boy, that's an awful lot of pressure. We can't put 600 psi in the patient's heart. So what they'll do is they'll dial it down to 200 psi, 300 psi, some lower pressure, like that would be just fine in the patient's heart. Now what's going to happen is now they have set that pressure limit too low. Now when we actually perform this injection, when we shoot this 5 milliliter per second injection, and we only limit the pressure inside the syringe to 200 psi, let's say, the injector will pressure limit. The injector will not actually inject at a rate of 5 milliliters per second. It will be injecting at a much, much slower rate. Now what that's doing is everybody's expecting a rate of 5 milliliters per second. We're expecting a certain quantity of fluid into the patient during this procedure so that we see the blood vessels show up nice and clear on the actual X-ray image. But now my injector is shooting really, really slow. We're not getting nearly as much contrast in the region of interest as everybody's expecting. And what does that do? Now those blood vessels don't show up as nice, bright white areas on the image. They're darker because not as much contrast is in the region of interest. More X-rays are penetrating the blood vessels, so the blood vessels are too dark. So if that's the case, then we have to go back and fix that injection. So now we have to fire the patient up again with another X-ray image. So now because the operator did not understand pressure limiting, and they set the pressure limit lower than it was supposed to be set to, now we have to hit the patient again with another X-ray, which is just added needless patient dose. So that's why it's important that the operators understand the purpose of pressure limiting and how to use it. And again, the vast majority of them do, but every now and then you run into one that doesn't. They think they know what they're doing with the pressure limiting, but they don't quite understand it. One last thing on pressure limiting. Again, this kind of harkens back to you've seen them all, but there are subtle differences between each injector type and injector model, small differences, and this is one of them. For CT and MRI systems, the pressure limit should be set to max. As high as the CT system or the CT injector or the MRI injector can go, that's what it should be set to. As a matter of fact, Medrad's MRI injector, the Spectra Solaris, the operator can't select pressure limits. Factory set at 300 psi. It's not even a selectable option to the operator. General rule of thumb, though, all CT and MRI procedures or all CT and MRI injectors, maximum pressure limit is 300 psi. Angio, again, because for CT and MRI injectors, they only go up to flow rates of 10 milliliters per second, because CT and MRI procedures are just slower procedures than angiographic procedures are. So slower procedures means we don't need as fast injection, so the lower flow rates, lower pressures. Angio injectors, on the other hand, are capable of very high flow rates, 40 to 50 milliliters per second, so they're capable of very high pressure limits. But the difference between the angio injector and the CT injector, all CT and MRI injectors go through an IV needle. All CT and MRI injections are performed through an IV needle. So it's basically the same size orifice that every single shot's being shot through. Angiographic injections, on the other hand, they are injected through catheters. All angiographic procedures, they don't shoot through IV needles, they shoot through catheters. And there's multiple size catheters. There's different lengths and diameters of catheters. So the pressure limit for angiographic procedures is determined by the rating of the catheter. So if you look on that packaging that the catheter came in, one of the items listed on there is the pressure rating of the catheter. That's what the pressure limit should be set to for angiographic procedures. I mean, catheters range anywhere from 600 being rated at 600 psi to in excess of 1200 psi in some cases. Now, moving on to something called rise or fall time. If you picture your garden hose sitting in the front of your lawn. If you have the capability of turning your, let me back this up a little bit and pause it. If you had the capability of turning your garden hose on full blast instantaneously, all right? The moment that the fluid shot out the end of your garden hose, it would jump. It wouldn't just sit there and firing out fluid. It would cause it to whip, okay? The same thing can happen with angiographic procedures because remember, a catheter is a long, thin tube that we snake into a patient's artery or vein. It's basically a very long, very, very thin hose, so to speak. And remember, angio-injectors are capable of very high injections, 30, 40, 50 milliliter per second flow rates. If we go from 0 to 50 milliliter per second injection instantaneously, there's going to be a great deal of whip or recoil the second that fluid starts firing out the tip of that IV needle. I'm sorry, out the tip of that catheter. What that's called is catheter whip, and we don't want that to occur. We don't want the tip of the catheter to move around in the patient while we're actually performing the injection. So to prevent this, and well, actually this is just a demonstration of it. Here's an image of a tube going from nothing to instantaneous full blast. This is referred to as catheter whip. Okay. Now to keep that from happening, you see here we have a flow rate of 30 milliliters per second. We're going to perform the injection, and the syringe instantly goes to full speed. Now that can cause catheter whip. Now to prevent that from happening, what we can do is we can program something called a rise time. Now if you look right here, we're going to program a 0.3 second rise time. Now what that's going to do is, pause this for a second. Now instead of, when we start the injection, instead of going from 0 straight immediately to 30 milliliter per second flow rate, we will take 0.3 seconds to go from 0 to our selected flow rate. So by slowly rising up to our selected flow rate, that diminishes or eliminates catheter whip. And we perform the injection, and we see our syringe slowly build up to full speed. Now, as a general rule of thumb, the rise time that they would select is always 1/100th of our selected flow rate. Go back here, do the math, pause it. We have a selected flow rate of 30 milliliters per second. So our rise time, it says rise fall, they never use a fall time. They never go from a higher flow rate to a lower flow rate over time. The rise time is always going to be 1/100th of our flow rate. So our flow rate is 30, so our rise time is 1/100th of 30, or 0.3. Any questions? Let me know. All right. One of the other aspects that the operator can select on the display is something called a delay. We don't always necessarily want the injector and the imaging system to start at the same time. There are instances where we want the imaging system to start imaging, and then so many seconds later the injector starts injecting. That's referred to as inject delay. And obviously the opposite of that would be we want the injector to start injecting. So many seconds later we want the imaging system to start imaging. That's referred to as scan or X-ray delay. There's 3 different types of contrast injectors. CT and MRI injectors refer to it as scan delay. Our angiographic or X-ray injectors refer to it as X-ray delay, but it's exactly the same concept. Now this is a function, KBO, for all you biomeds out there who have ever worked on infusion pumps. You're painfully familiar with the function of KBO. What KBO is, if a patient has an IV needle stuck in their arm somewhere, if there are long periods of time where there's actually no fluid injected through the IV needle, a blood clot can form at the tip of the IV needle. And to prevent this from happening, what systems will do is it will periodically, every 30 seconds, something like that, will just inject a small quantity of fluid out the tip of the IV needle just to keep the vein open, just to prevent a blood clot from forming at the IV site. Now this function, KBO, this is not on all contrast injectors. Not all contrast injectors do this. Angio injectors don't do this. Some CT injectors do it, some don't. All MRI injectors do this. It's just again, it's the nature of the beast. It's how the systems are used. CT and MRI injectors need it sometimes. Angio injectors never need the function. Now, arming and injecting, actually performing an injection. Before we hit the start switch and it actually starts making fluid coming out of the end of it, we have to arm the injector. Now, arming the injector, as soon as we arm the injector, there's some visual indicator to the operator that the injector is armed, and if they hit that button, it's going to start injecting. Now, let me back up here a split second. Those are the arming lights telling the operator that we're armed. As soon as we hit the arm button, that was me. Previous. There we go. Go back up here. Now, as soon as we hit the arm button, pause, a message pops up, and this is true of all contrast injectors. There's going to be, during class, I call this the point of no liability return for the OEM, for the manufacturer. Whenever, and this is true of every injector, whenever the operator hits the arm button, which you saw me do right here, a little message is going to pop up. Different models have different messages, but the gist of the message is always the same. Do you wish to confirm that you have checked for air? It's asking the operator, at this point right now, we're getting ready, we're arming the injector because we want to inject fluid into the patient. So as soon as we hit this arm button, the message pops up, do you wish to confirm you have checked for air? This is the operators telling the machine, yes, there is no air in the syringe, and there is no air in the connector tubing. So as soon as the operator clicks yes, there I am, now we are armed. We are flashing armed. Now, the injector does not actually check for air in the syringe. The air could have nothing but air in the syringe. But if the operator says, yep, I've checked for air and we are cleared, the injector is now armed and it will shoot. So again, this is just a safety feature that prevents us from injecting air into the patient, and it also prevents us from inadvertently injecting the patient before we were ready to, because it needs to be a two-step process. You can't just pick the button up and hit it by accident and start the injection prematurely. We want to make sure that we are truly ready to start injecting by arming the injector first. Now, there's two different arming modes that injectors can be put in. That is single and multi. Now, a single arm is just that. Back up here. I hit single. And it's asking us, air removed from 200 milliliter syringe, question mark. I have to hit the yes button. As soon as we hit yes, we hit the button, and now we are armed. Now, when we perform this injection, hold the button down, the injection is performed, and the injection is over. Now, if the operator knows they're going to do the same injection over and over and over again, all right, we're going to shoot the same 10 milliliter per second flow rate and same 20 milliliter volume for multiple shots in a row. So I don't have to rearm after every single shot. We can hit multi-arm, which is what we just did. Now what will happen is when we perform our injection, we hit the button, perform the injection, injection's over, and without rearming, you just hit the button again, and it will shoot again. It will keep this up as long as there is enough fluid left in the syringe to perform to give us the volume that we requested in the protocol. It will continuously rearm itself after each shot until there's not enough fluid to do another shot. So that's the difference between a single arm and a multi-arm injection. Now, that is not to be confused with something called a single phase and a multi-phase injection. These are two different things, obviously. Now, a single-phase injection is when the when the operator wants to shoot a single injection at a specific flow rate for a specific volume, and then the injection is over. Now, a multi-phase injection, we'll show examples of this here in a second. A multi-phase injection is if we want to start the injection off at one flow rate, then change to a different flow rate after we've started the injection, or if we have an injector with two syringes, a contrast syringe and a saline syringe, we want to start the injection shooting one fluid, then we want to switch over to a different fluid. All right? Now, this is a single phase injection right here. if you look, we have, back up and explain this screen a little bit. This particular injector, this is my Spectra Solaris, and this is a 2-syringe injector. So I have my A syringe here that has 62.9 milliliters of fluid in it at this moment, and it's green. So this is my contrast syringe. Green is the universal color for contrast. Then my other syringe, the B syringe, it's blue, so that's water or saline, has 115 milliliters of saline in it. Now, this line right here, this single row right here, this 5.0 is my flow rate, milliliters per second. This 10.0 is my volume in milliliters. So this is a single phase injection. We are going to shoot a contrast shot at a flow rate of 5 milliliters per second and a volume of 10 milliliters. Then we're done. So this is just a single phase injection. Arm it, confirm, perform the injection. It's a 2-second shot, so it's going to be over quick. And we're done. So that is a single phase injection. Now, multi-phase injection, if we want to change the flow rate, notice that here we have 2 rows, phase 1, phase 2. Notice they are 2 different flow rates. We want to start off at a flow rate of 5, then we want to move to a flow rate of 3. So we're going to slow the injection down. It starts faster, then it slows down. That is a multi-phase injection if we wish to change the flow rate in the middle of the injection. We can increase the flow rate or decrease the flow rate. It doesn't matter. But to do it, we need to program a multi-phase injection, in this case a 2-phase injection. And the other reason we would program a multi-phase injection is if we want to change syringes. Here we are starting off with our contrast fluid, flow rate of 5, volume of 10. We want to switch over to the saline syringe, flow rate of 5, volume of 10. So when we perform this injection, arm it. Where am I at? There we go. Confirm. Perform the injection. Now we are starting off with contrast, and it automatically moves to saline without the operator having to hit the button multiple times. And the injection is complete. Now, some injectors have multi-phase capabilities. You can program up to 4 phases. Some do 6 phases, and some do 8 phases. Just depends on the model and the type of the contrast injector. All right. Are there any questions right now before I move on to, I mean, we're about finished here. Any questions before I move on to maintenance and test equipment and things like that? We good? All right. Now, typically a PM, I mentioned this earlier, I think, a little bit. A typical PM is going to take about an hour or so. What's going to determine, to be honest, the biggest determinant of how much or how long your PM is going to take you is how much cleaning you need to do. If the operators throughout the year have been diligent about cleaning the system off, which they are supposed to do, it tells them the operator, clean daily, weekly, monthly, and annual. If they are doing that, then it really will make your life a lot easier. We know that they don't always do that, but if they are doing a good job of cleaning up the contrast as they spill it onto the injector, then it is a relatively easy PM to get through. But contrast is kind of like super glue. When it dries hard. Sometimes I've seen guys have to take a hammer and a flathead screwdriver and chisel away the contrast that's built up so thick. When you're cleaning contrast off, you're not supposed to use any cleaning solvents at all. All the OEMs say hot water and a rag and elbow grease. That's how you dry. That's how you clean the contrast off. As a matter of fact, if you have a component that's got contrast all over it, if you can just drop that component in a tub of hot water, that's really the best way to go. Obviously, you wouldn't do that with electronic components, but if you have covers and plastic pieces and metal pieces that have contrast all over it, the easiest way to clean it off, really, just drop it in a bucket of hot water, come back in 10 minutes, and it will literally all have dissolved away nice and clean. Then the other part of your typical PM is you're going to do operational checks. You're going to check the flow rate, you check the volume, you check other functions if the system has it, such as KVO, holds, pauses, delays, a few of the things we talked about like that. And then the calibrations and the verifications, you're going to be checking on pretty much all the contrast injectors, all your pressure limits. Again, all these are done annually. Some injectors, to be honest, some injectors are easier than others. Some injectors, like your CT and your MRI injectors, they're easier to perform your maintenance on than angiographic injectors. Angiographic injectors just kind of have a few more things going on with them that have to be checked versus your CT and MRI injectors. CT and MRI injectors generally take less than an hour if there's not a whole lot of cleaning involved. Angio injectors, and I'm primarily talking about the Mark V Plus and Provis. There's nothing wrong with a Mark V Plus or Provis injector. It's just they just have more going on under the hood that needs to be documented than CT and MRI injectors typically do. So for angio injectors, you're probably going to be looking at a little bit more than an hour typically if there's not an extensive cleaning needed. Now, some of the most common issues. One of the biggest issues by far that's going to be a headache for you and have you called down to take a look at it is fluid breaches into the injector head. When the operators are filling the syringes up, they tend to spill contrast. Sometimes they can spill a lot of contrast. And when contrast gets down inside the head, it can wreak havoc, obviously. These are just a few pictures of a stellate that, to be honest, I have no idea how they let this much contrast get into the head. This is the worst case scenario here. A couple other pictures here. This is the LED board, and you can see the corrosion that the contrast did to this particular board. This is the back plate that the back cover of the stellate that we took off, or that the guys took off, and you see the damage that was done here. I've never seen anything this bad, but this is the damage that the contrast fluid getting into the injector head can do. One of the other most common issues with a lot of contrast injectors is fraying of the head cable. I said there's three components to every injector. There's the head, the display, and the main unit. The injector head has a cable coming out of it that connects to the main unit. That cable is called the head cable. Now, if you'll recall, whenever we are filling the syringe, the injector head is pointed up. Whenever we are injecting, the injector head is pointed down. So every single time they fill and inject that injector head, they are tilting it up and tilting it down. So that head cable coming out of the injector head takes a lot of flexing at the point of entry where the cable goes into the head. And this is not an unusual sight at all right here. The head cable just sort of wearing off with all the flexing that's taken place on it over the years. Replacing a head cable is, you don't need special training to replace a head cable. Any general biomed, any imaging biomed could do it. It's just sometimes it's a little time consuming because when you take the covers off, there's a lot of strain reliefs, there's a lot of tie straps you got to cut. So it's not difficult. It can take anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes depending on the model of the head cable that you're swapping out. The other problems, the most common issues, the display board on the injector head. And this is, again, pretty much universal of all contrast injectors, make, model, manufacturer, it doesn't matter. This is the display board on the injector head. On this one's the stellate. But this board gets beat up more than most other boards, pretty much on all the models, for two reasons. One, this is the board that the operator is touching and pushing buttons on and things like that. And this is also the board that's getting fluids spilled on it. So the display board on the injector head, again, it's not every year, but of all the components on an injector, the display board is one of the more highly failure items for the reasons that I mentioned. And then, like a lot of equipment, or most, I'm assuming we're all biomeds here. Operator error is one of the other big maintenance issues that you will have with the injector. They're not quite using it right. The biggest one, primarily, as I mentioned earlier, is they're not programming the pressure limit properly. So they'll call you up saying the injector's shooting too slow, or the injector has shut down, or it didn't shoot the amount of fluid that they thought. Typically, those things are not legitimate issues. It's just the operators not using the machine quite the way it was designed to be used. Again, if I have operators here, the vast majority of the operators know how to use them. It's just, you have that 1 in 50 or 1 in 100 operator who doesn't quite understand the exact concept of utilizing it. Now, when it comes to the test equipment, we here at Maull Biomedical, we do have a test kit that we do sell. There's 2 different levels of test kits. In the test kit, the primary things located in the test kit are a pressure gauge, pressure orifices, and tubing we use to measure pressures, measure the pressure limits when we're verifying them, calibrating them, graduated cylinder, and then finally these first 3 items here, and there's other small things too. I'm not going to list everything on here. but these are the main things. So the pressure gauge, the orifices and tubing in the graduated cylinder, and a few other small items. These are part of the Tier 1 test equipment. The Tier 1 piece of test equipment is if you're doing CT and MRI injectors. If you're doing angio injectors as well, which most people who get trained, they're doing angio injectors as well. This is your Mark 5 Plus, your Provis, your Angiomet Illumina. For angiographic injectors, you also need a digital timer, and that's what a Tier 2 piece or a Tier 2 test kit is. Tier 1 is all these items. Tier 2 is all these items with a digital timer. So if you came to the training for this, one of the things you have to arrange for after training is the test equipment. Now the pressure gauge is just your standard pressure gauge, but there is, I don't want to say, my finger's covering up most of it, but there is a specialized brass connector. Oh, that was me again. There is a sort of a specialized brass connector that is attached to the wire pressure gauge here. You can't, because a lot of times when people say, oh, we already have a pressure gauge, well, I know every biomed shop has a pressure gauge, but you have a pressure gauge that can attach directly to a syringe that's capable of measuring 1,000 pounds PSI without blowing off. Typically, the answer to that question is no. That's what this down here is for, connected to the pressure gauge, and then our connector here is for the special orifice. This red orifice right here that I'm connecting to it is a special orifice specially made to measure specific pressures on the injectors. And if we don't use the orifice, then we use a 20, 21, or 24 gauge needle, depending on the machine, to do the same thing the red orifice does, and that's measure a specific pressure during a specific flow rate through the pressure gauge. And then, like I said, the pressure gauge is always attached directly to the syringe, and that's one of the things that is the problem. Most biomed shops, again, most biomed shops do have a pressure gauge, and they just don't have a pressure gauge that can attach to the syringe. And then finally, the digital timer. As you can see, it's a BC Biomedical, or BC Group especially makes this thing. Unfortunately for the angiographic injectors, just a stopwatch is not good enough. The time tolerance for the angiographic injectors is you're shooting a 4-second injection, and it has to be within 0.02 seconds. So just a handheld stopwatch is not reliable enough. You have to electronically connect the digital pressure gauge to your test points on your angiographic injectors to accurately measure a 4-second injection, again, plus or minus 0.02. So this is the only thing that is different between a Tier 1 test kit and a Tier 2 test kit. I hope that was helpful. That's basically the end of our presentation. If you go to our website, we actually have this, everything I just went over. We actually have the training for free, operation training and introduction to contrast injectors free online, and then we contrast injector training here at Maull Biomedical, and here's our contact information if you want to contact us for any more information. We have our upcoming training dates, and then we do 6 or 8 times a year. We, if a hospital or a medical group in a certain city or area has 5 or more students, then we bring the show on the road and do it at your place for no extra charge.
Great. Well, thank you for your presentation today, Steve. We did have some questions come throughout.
Yep.
So we have a few more minutes if you want to get to a couple of those.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So the first one here, what about recommended rubber goods replacements or PM kits provided by vendors?
Well, there is a PM kit, and I don't like calling it PM kit because we basically have a partner company called Injector Support and Service. They're over Orlando, Florida, and we work together in the sense that Maull Biomedical does training and they do everything else: service, tools, test equipment, loaners, exchanges, parts, things like that. I just like teaching, so I didn't want to get into the cutthroat world of parts and all that sort of stuff. So that's basically why we partnered up. And the guys at Injector Support and Service, the owner's name is Ryan Clark. Very nice, super good guy, very knowledgeable, very helpful over the phone. They actually have PM kits that they sell that are model specific. They have them for the Stellant, Provis, Spectra Solaris, Envision, Mark 5 Plus. I think a couple of the other models. But when we say PM kit, when a biomed or an imaging guy hears the term PM kit, they think, okay, these are all the parts that need to be replaced during a PM, and that's not the case. None of the manufacturers and none of the models have parts that have to be replaced annually. Everything is replaced as needed. So what these PM kits, or more specifically these parts kits, are that you can purchase from ISS, these are the parts that get replaced most often. And for the most part, those are gaskets and O-rings and things like that. The rubber parts that do take a beating throughout the year. The majority of the parts kits that they sell are those components. And they vary in price depending on the model. Some of them are only a couple $100, and I think one of them goes up to $1,300. But that's actually got a high-end part in it that isn't usually needed. But if you have a whole fleet of these injectors, then it's probably good to have at least one of these on hand.
Great, thank you.
Yep, well, that was good enough. Next question.
Yeah, perfect. We do have one more here. Are calibrations and verifications required when certain parts are replaced? If so, which types of parts?
About the only thing that you need to replace, well, I shouldn't say the only. For the most part, anytime you replace a board or any major component like that, I would at least go through a calibration verification. I would check them out. No matter what board you replace, whatever board you tweak, if there's a potentiometer you turn, I would at least go back and verify the calibrations. And primarily, I'm talking about the pressure limit calibrations. For the most part, the boards that you're replacing don't affect the pressures, even though some OEMs will tell you, I mean, if you replace anything, oh, you got to recalibrate it. That's just not true. About the only time that you do actually have to perform a recalibration for most of the injectors is if you replace the CPU board, if you replace a motor that actually drives the plungers back and forth, or if you replace the board. Typically it's called the power drive card or the power drive board. So the CPU board, a motor, or the motor control board, the power drive card, those are the boards that, those are the components. If you replace those, then you probably will have to perform an adjustment to the pressure limit calibration. But most of the time, if you replace those and if you just go back and check them again, the manufacturer's tolerances for flow rate and volume and pressures are relatively wide. So it's rare that you fall outside of the manufacturer's specifications.
Great. Well, we did have a few extra questions, but we're running short on time today. So if you asked a question and we didn't get a chance to answer it during the call, feel free. Steve is going to get a copy of those questions and can follow up with you directly. We want to go ahead and wrap up today's call by thanking you, Steve, and also today's sponsor, Maull Biomedical Training. One lucky attendee will win lunch for their whole department. Details are included in the post-webinar survey, which will appear on your screen shortly. You must complete the survey to obtain your certificate of attendance. If you do not see the survey, email us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. Thanks so much, everyone, and until next time.
Thank you.